So I have my own notes. I'm just going to flip over the computer. All right, so I'll be as brief and as quick as I can because this is an oral history of game criticism blogging from 2007 till now. So if any of you don't know me, my name is Ben Abraham. I'm a PhD student, kind of doing research into games and game communities online. Well, that's where I started anyway. But I've been involved with a site called Critical Distance for a few years now, and a couple of years before that I got into this game Blogosphere thing. And so what I'm going to do today is just sort of tell the story of what I've been involved with and I guess what I can share. So I'm going to offer like a theory about the recent sort of online games blogging community. That there are sort of three main eras, so that I was involved in anyway. The first one is this sort of golden age or golden era from 2007 to 2008, which started with a Twitter conversation between Michael Abbott of the Brainy Gamer blog and Steve Gaynor, who many of you will know through the game Gone Home. They had a conversation about 2008. Why was that such a great output for a lot of bloggers? There were lots of really great games then as well. It was all to do with that sort of question. So we had like the first Modern Warfare, we had Bioshock, Far Cry 2, Fallout 3, all these great games. And the thing about games criticism in this era was that it was sort of very blog-based, or this is what I'm going to be sort of arguing anyway. The second era was the sort of community expansion era, and we've just sort of come out of, I think, that period where the number of people involved in game criticism sort of like trebled or even quadrupled. And important hub sites sort of came to the fore. So things like Critical Distance, the Border House, and the conversation kind of went online towards Twitter rather than being centered on blogs. And then from 2013 onwards, I'm going to argue we've sort of entered this sort of modern era where sort of a diversification of topics and speakers has kind of occurred. So this is a completely partial account. I'm not arguing that this is like the definitive way to understand games criticism or even games criticism online. This is just what I've experienced. There would totally be other accounts that explain or add depth or other elements to this sort of story. And I don't go back to like the beginning of games criticism because there are sites that predate all of this stuff. So things like Old Man Murray, insert credits, I think, and some of Charlie Brooker's pieces all began like before 2007. So there's like a long history that I'm not even connecting with. This is just like my personal sort of account. So to begin with, I first joined this sort of like games criticism community in 2007, and it kind of started with this blog called The Brainy Gamer, which a lot of people I'm sure will have heard of, even if you haven't like read it recently. And it was started by this guy Michael Abbott, who was a drama professor from Wabash College. He made daily posts back in the day, and he was on sabbatical, so he had the freedom and the time to do that. And a lot of us who were involved then, we got really into comment thread discussions, and they were often really lengthy. A lot of us found our voice online in this period. And there was a very sort of lively conversation happening in the comments thread of this blog at the time. And it was a very US and Australian based community. So there was a very definitive split between the US and Australia and the UK, probably based on like time zones, but not necessarily even because of that. I think there was just like a strange attraction to the site. Anyway, so there were other UK places that I just sort of only vaguely knew about and didn't participate in too much, and most of them were sort of around Rock Paper Shotgun as another centre for criticism. A really important name in this sort of era was Maggie Green, who was the weekend editor of Kotaku at the time, and she did basically as much for the early games criticism community as someone like Michael Abbott, who was actually doing the posting. She sent so much traffic to these like early blogs, The Brainy Gamer, David Carlton's blog, Chris Bateman's iHobo blog, a whole bunch of other ones at the same sort of time. And Ian Bogost mentioned that so I interviewed Maggie Green as part of my PhD research, and she told me the story of Ian thanking her one time for sending him a link. And she said, wow, that really made her realize how important her work was, if even Ian was recognizing like that he was getting extra traffic from it and, you know, getting known by it. And there was a really cool early series of posts by a guy called Michael Wallbridge, who interviewed a bunch of these early game bloggers. So that was Michael Abbott and Guy Kroll, who many of you might remember, had a really great blog called Level Up with Newsweek. He interviewed Kieran Gillen, Lee Alexander, Chris Darlin, and Mitch Kripata, and elaborated the sort of connection between their blogs and the way they often like referenced each other and had like quite intimate conversations. So this community was kind of given this sort of awkward name, the Brainosphere, by an Australian academic and blogger, Dan Golding, and that was at the start of 2009, and he had a list of about 50 blogs that were sort of involved in this sort of community at the time. And all of the initial volunteers who joined this site that I started at the beginning of 2009 called Critical Distance were taken from that Brainy Gamer community. They were just people that I met through commenting and were heavily, I think, inspired by Michael Abbott in particular and that community that he fostered. And the effects of his site were that lots of people started their own blog and they sort of emulated this Brainy Gamer model. So the kind of posts that often got made were particularly personal, or they were often a specialist perspective. So mine was a music and sound themed games blog, because that was my area of speciality at the time. I was doing an undergrad honors thesis on games and music. Dan Golding had one on like games and geography and games and space. Dan Bruno did like games and music and transcription, and he was really great at it. And unfortunately, it just by default was a whole bunch of us white dudes, and that was like really problematic in hindsight. So the second era that I'm going to describe is this community expansion era, and that, I think, sort of, I'm not going to put it down to Critical Distance itself starting. I'm going to actually invert that relationship and say that Critical Distance began as a response to this increase in number and diversity and just the sheer volume of games criticism that was happening towards the end of 2008 and the start of 2009. And so a whole bunch of us got together on IRC and decided, hey, we want to organize the community. We want to do something more about it. And so we started like Critical Distance, basically. And during this period, Twitter became hugely important, and the place where the conversation happened, that sort of like elusive thing, the conversation, moved to Twitter, which was a really important shift. And heaps of people joined this period. And because of Twitter, I guess, it became a much more open and acceptable thing to join this sort of conversation. Anyone could kind of jump in rather than having to wade into like a 100-page long comment thread. So there were other institutions, I guess, during this period. So there was Killscreen, the print magazine, and the Border House started as well, partially in response to a perceived failing on the part of us at Critical Distance to like include and do more to recognize the need to encourage diversity in games criticism. And that was actually really fantastic that happened. And I mean, obviously, we all know the Border House now. It's like totally famous, and that's awesome. And so I'm not going to talk too much about that era because most people, I think, are pretty familiar with that. But finally, I'll get to this sort of most recent period, which was kicked off, I think, by Brendan Keogh's Killing is Harmless. And basically what it did is it proved that people could do games criticism and get paid for it, make money off of it. And it just sort of changed the perception of games criticism being like stuck in this sort of backwater of, just relegated to blogs. And according to Brendan Keogh, it did pretty well financially wise, whatever that means. You can ask him later. And the other important feature, I think, of this sort of modern era is well, we have all these other long-form games criticism, so that's sort of developing now. We've got heaps of other magazines and self-publishing outlets, and the all-important Patron, which I think we can all recognize is really, really important now to supporting games criticism and making it sort of viable. So that's sort of my potted history, and I hope that's sort of been useful. Thanks.